The remainder of Anne's time at Uppercross, comprehending only 2 days, was spent entirely at the mansion house, and she had the satisfaction of knowing. I'm Ellen.
And I'm Harriet, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're reading chapters 13 to 15 of Persuasion, so let's start with your 100-word summary.
Okay, so what I had is Anne leaves Uppercross to stay with Lady Russell, and the Musgroves go to Lyme. Anne and Lady Russell call on the Crofts, who Anne secretly thinks are managing Kellynch better than Sir Walter. Charles and Mary return from Lyme, and Charles thinks that Benwick will call on Anne, but he doesn't. Mr and Mrs Musgrove come home for their younger children's Christmas holidays, and Anne learns that Captain Wentworth is visiting his brother in Shropshire. Elizabeth writes that Mr Elliot is in Bath and forgiven by the family. When Anne goes to Bath, she meets him on her first evening. So that was my 100 words, and I think it was exactly 100 words.
Right. Well, I've started with something that's out of place, I'm afraid. Anne has recovered her bloom. The Musgrove family, with Anne's assistance, moved to Lyme, where Wentworth remains. Anne and Lady Russell call on the Crofts at Kellynch. Charles and Mary return and discuss Captain Benwick's interest in Anne. The older Musgroves return to Uppercross for Christmas with their children. Anne joins her father and sister in Bath and discovers that Mr Elliot is now a frequent visitor. He, with the help of his friend Colonel Wallace, have revealed extenuating circumstances regarding the earlier break. Anne finds Mr Elliot good-mannered and sensible.
In the published version of Persuasion, these chapters are the start of Volume 2. And of course, because it was published after Jane Austen's death, we have no idea if that was what she envisaged, if she was planning to write more, etc. But these, and particularly the first 2 chapters we're talking about, do feel like a short transitional period between Uppercross and Lyme and the second section of the book, which is all in Bath, and is sort of in a holding pattern until going to Bath.
2 points I wanted to make about chapter 13. The first is just because I like these mentions, is this mention of the old nurse who's been kept on. Not that that's anything special, except over and over again we find Jane Austen being a very early user of something that turns up in books about families of this sort through, all the people you can think of, at least up to Noel Stretfield and probably further.
Noel Stretfield's the one I think of. Her semi-factual book, Grand Nanny, but also in Ballet Shoes, Nana has been Sylvia's Nana, and then she's just hanging around, helping out until the babies turn up, and suddenly she's back being Nana again.
No, actually, suddenly I've thought of 2 more. They turn up in Charlotte Young, which you'd expect 19th century, but another place that turns up is in Brideshead Revisited.
That was actually the other one I was just thinking of. She's just sitting away in a room tucked away at the back of Brideshead, just doing her own thing, waiting for grandchildren to come along, but Charles goes to see her during the war.
And this is the thing, nobody seems to keep the governesses on. A bit later in novels, when you've got slightly more active mistresses of the house, the governess in novels does move into the position of secretary, particularly the engagement secretary for the lady of the house. Yeah. But you don't get that until, say, novels of the 1930s.
Except, I think, in Emma, by the time Miss Taylor marries Mr Weston, Emma isn't really needing a governess anymore, but she's still there, and she probably is serving a sort of... She's almost like being a companion, except that Emma isn't the old lady who needs a paid companion.
Yes, I suppose the governesses also turn into companions, but it's this business of them transferring from being a governess to being the ex-pupils' mothers.
Yes, the difference is the nanny or the nursery maid hangs around doing little bits and pieces, and then when the next generation of babies come along, she goes back to being the nursery maid. Whereas the governess doesn't necessarily go back to being a governess to the new round of children. Once she's transitioned to being the social secretary, maybe she stays in that role.
Yes. And then the second thing I wanted to say about chapter 13 is, I think you were saying before how Anne doesn't go in much for self-pity, but we have definitely got Jane Austen. Well, it's the passage that says, "A few months hence, and the room now so deserted, occupied by her silent, pensive self, might be filled again with all that was happy and gay, and all that was not Anne Elliot."
Yes.
I think Anne is feeling pretty sorry for herself. Jane Austen is also feeling terribly sorry for her. In a sense, she's also brooding about what she thinks is going to be the outcome of Louisa's fall.
Yeah. After the bit about her being depressed, it also does say that, reflecting back on her time at Uppercross, scenes had passed which made it precious, and it's almost like she's seen Captain Wentworth again and it's given her closure. It says, "It stood the record of many sensations of pain, once severe but now softened, and some instances of relenting feeling, some breathings of friendship and reconciliation which could never be looked for again and which could never cease to be dear." So I think she does feel things have moved on just a bit with Wentworth.
Yes, except, of course, it's completely inaccurate foretelling of the future.
Yeah. So then Anne goes to Kellynch Lodge to stay with Lady Russell for a few weeks. And this is where we get to the bit about signs of Anne's bloom coming back, because it says that, "Happily either Anne was improved in plumpness and looks, or Lady Russell fancied her so, and Anne, in receiving her compliments on the occasion, had the amusement of connecting them with the silent admiration of her cousin, and of hoping that she was to be blessed with a second spring of youth and beauty." They do have to talk about Captain Wentworth a little bit, not too much, but it does say that Lady Russell feels about Wentworth, internally her heart revelled in angry pleasure, in pleased contempt, that the man who at 23 had seemed to understand somewhat of the value of an Anne Elliot should 8 years afterwards be charmed by a Louisa Musgrove. So it's almost like her thinking to herself, see, I was right, he didn't deserve her.
Yes.
And the other thing that happens in chapter 13 is the lovely, lovely scene where Anne and Lady Russell call on the Crofts.
Oh, yes.
And Lady Russell is saying, we must psych ourselves up for this. And Anne is quietly thinking, well, actually, the Crofts are really good people, and I think they're much better landholders than Sir Walter and Elizabeth. Lady Russell really gets on well with Mrs Croft. She's not quite so keen on Admiral Croft because he's not quite refined enough for her.
But on the other hand, Anne thinks he's just lovely.
Yeah, well, he is.
The stuff about the looking glasses.
Yeah.
That I find so terribly funny.
There's three things he says. The first one is that they keep their umbrellas hanging up by the shrubbery door. A good place is it not, but you will not think it a good place, for yours are always kept in the butler's room. The notes in my Cambridge edition comment on this that the detail underlines Sir Walter's need to be served, even at the cost of common sense and his own convenience.
The implication is surely when Sir Walter leaves the building, the butler who lets everybody else in lets him out. So if it's going to be raining and he says to the butler, I want to go outside, the butler nips down to his room and collects the umbrella.
Yeah.
Whereas Admiral and Mrs Croft don't bother the butler. If they want to go out, they just get their umbrellas and go.
And they go out via the shrubbery door rather than out the front door. The next thing he says is, we've made very few changes. We told you about the laundry door, and he feels that that's been a great improvement. The wonder was how any family upon earth could bear with the inconvenience of its opening as it did so long. The Cambridge edition doesn't have anything to say about that, but I wondered if the subtext is Sir Walter and Elizabeth never actually used the laundry door.
No.
They never went into the laundry, whereas Admiral and Mrs Croft do.
Mrs Croft is busy there overseeing the wash.
Yeah.
Whereas the person who'd oversee it for Elizabeth she would have a housekeeper, or else she's using somebody like the old nursery maid.
Yeah. Whereas Mrs Croft is probably in there with the housekeeper overseeing the wash.
Yes.
Rather than just delegating it to the housekeeper.
Yes.
And then the final thing Admiral Croft says, which is the funniest of all, is that the only other change he made is to get rid of all the looking glasses from the room, and he got Sophie to help haul them out, so he didn't even get the staff to help. And again, just the lovely personality of the Admiral coming through when looking with serious reflection. I should think he must be a rather dressy man for his time of life. And then finishing up by saying, I am now quite snug with my little shaving glass in one corner and another great thing that I never go near. The Admiral is such a nice person. So that brings us on to chapter 14. Charles and Mary are the first of the Musgrove clan to come back from Lyme, even though Anne thinks they've stayed there much longer than they could conceivably have been wanted. Mary goes on about what a good time she's had in Lyme. There'd been so much going on every day. They'd walked from their lodgings to the Harvilles. She'd got books from the library. She'd changed them regularly.
And there were lots more people at church to have a look at.
Yes, and she'd bathed, and she'd been taken to Charmouth. And all this, joined to the source of being so very useful, had made it really an agreeable fortnight.
A little bit later on, though, she has that complaint, doesn't she, about the Harvilles only had a maidservant serving a dinner. And Mary thought that it wasn't good enough. Mary thinks she should have a man there behind you at the table. It's just an interesting little bit of information rather than significant for the book. One of those things that I'm notching away to get a picture of what they do with servants.
And then we have this wonderful, another clash between Charles and Mary, where Charles is saying Captain Benwick is interested in Anne, and Mary's saying, no, of course he's not interested in Anne.
I think that's one of the top comic scenes in Jane Austen, because it hasn't got anything particularly nasty about it. There's something nasty about the Dashwoods talking about giving the money.
About John and Fanny Dashwood's
yes,
hilarious conversation about money.
But I think this is almost as funny, and yet it doesn't have that nasty twist to it.
But also, I absolutely love this bit where Charles says the reason Benwick didn't come is because he realised that Uppercross is 3 miles from Kellynch. So I told him about Kellynch, and I told him the distance by road, and I told him of the church being very well worth seeing.
That was something I loved, that he knows that's one of the things you can use as an excuse. Yes.
And so he said that specifically to give Benwick an excuse to come to Kellynch, and while I'm here, I'll call on Anne.
Yes.
I just love this picture that he worked out why Benwick didn't want to come, and he thought, I will give Benwick an excuse to go to Kellynch so he can see Anne, which is what he wants to do. And I just think that's lovely of Charles.
Yes. Well, again, it shows how much nicer than Mary he is, because Mary can't bear anyone to prefer Anne to her. If Captain Benwick is coming to see them, he's coming to see her, not Anne.
Mary is so funny.
Yes. Like she's so transparent.
Yes. So then, after Charles and Mary, come Christmas time when it's school holidays and the unknown but large number of Musgrove children are home for the holidays.
Yes.
Mr and Mrs Musgrove come back, and Mrs Musgrove is so happy for this quiet cheerfulness.
Little quiet
cheerfulness, where in fact everything is bustling. Because as well as coming back themselves, they brought the little Harvilles as well. The whole place is, there's food everywhere. The girls are cutting up silk and gold paper. There's a roaring Christmas fire. Everyone's talking. And Anne finds it all a bit much, and so does Lady Russell. But Mrs Musgrove just is revelling in it.
Yes.
And then it finishes as Anne and Lady Russell leave, with Lady Russell saying, I hope I shall remember in future not to call it Uppercross in the Christmas holidays.
Well, that's one of the sentences you remember forever, isn't it?
Yeah. But then the narrator makes the point that Lady Russell found all the hustle and bustle of Uppercross at Christmas too much for her, and yet when they arrive in Bath and it's noisy and hustle and bustle, she's totally at home there and happy with it.
I suppose the other point I was interested in from that chapter was what it tells you about Captain Wentworth.
Yeah.
She tells us, though Anne hazarded no inquiries, there was voluntary communication sufficient. His spirits had been greatly recovering lately, as might be expected. As Louisa improved, he had improved, and he was now quite a different creature from what he had been the first week. He had not seen Louisa, and was so extremely fearful of ill consequences to her from an interview that he did not press for it at all, and on the contrary seemed to have a plan of going away for a week or 10 days till her head was stronger. are we thinking, he's so keen about Louisa? Are we looking at love for Louisa, or are we looking at guilt for letting her jump?
Yeah.
So we're being given this, just sort of building up a little bit of excitement, a little bit of foreseeing.
Yeah. And then come Christmas, we learn that he has in fact gone away, that he's gone to Shropshire to stay with his brother instead of Plymouth.
Well, we're starting to sort of ask this question, why did he keep away from her?
Yeah.
Was it guilt? Was it love?
Yeah.
And so we've got a little hint we can start thinking, is he coming round to Anne?
And the other thing we get right at the end of this chapter is Elizabeth has written to say that they've been seeing a lot of Mr Elliot and he's all forgiven for everything in the past.
Yes.
Which they're rather surprised about.
And Anne has got this ongoing worry about Mrs Clay and her father and what it will mean for Elizabeth.
The chapter finishes with Anne and Lady Russell arriving in Bath and Anne being dropped off at Camden Place. And we get this quite emotive language. She feels her progress through the streets to be, however disagreeable yet too rapid, for who would be glad to see her when she arrived? And she looks back with fond regret to the bustles of Uppercross and the seclusion of Kellynch. So again, she's feeling a little bit sorry for herself.
Not without reason.
Yeah.
But we're not getting a picture of stiff upper lip Anne so much.
But then when she goes into Camden Place at the start of the next chapter, it's really quite strong language where it says, Anne entered it with a sinking heart, anticipating an imprisonment of many months, and anxiously saying to herself, oh, when shall I leave you again?
Well, there she is, except for sort of the possible hope of Mr Elliot. I mean, she's got the worry of Mrs Clay. She's got nothing she really wants to see. Though, I mean, really, with sort of her cultural interests, when she goes to Bath, she's going to be going to concerts. She's going to be looking at displays of painting. Yeah. She's going to be reading all these new publications.
Though I suppose one thing we get, and I think we get more in this chapter than back at the start of the book, she is really very cynical about Sir Walter and Elizabeth, particularly Elizabeth.
Where she's hoping for Mr Elliot to be interested in her, where she said Elizabeth was certainly very handsome, with well-bred, elegant manners, and her character might never have been penetrated by Mr Elliot, knowing her but in public, and when very young herself. How her temper and understanding might bear the investigation of his present keener time of life was another concern, and rather a fearful one. Most earnestly did she wish that he might not be too nice or too observant if Elizabeth were his subject. I mean, is it cynical, or is it she doesn't really want to think this, but she can't close her eyes to it? Though hoping that Mr Elliot's going to be trapped by Elizabeth is a bit cynical, isn't it?
Also, she sighs that her father doesn't see anything to regret in the duties and dignity of the resident landholder, and that Elizabeth, who was once mistress of Kellynch, can now be proud of her 2 drawing rooms.
Well, we're back there to the glory of being a squire.
Yeah.
And the admirable position that it provides.
The first thing they talk about when she gets there is Mr Elliot and how wonderful he is.
Except that he's underhung.
Except that he's underhung.
I'd always thought underhung meant a sort of receding chin, but it doesn't. It means the lower teeth
are jutting out.
And I'd never really thought of Mr Elliot. Did you know he looked like that?
I don't tend to have mental pictures of characters.
Do you have any views of why she might have wanted him to be underhung?
Maybe she just had a mental picture of some person.
Or perhaps she was just trying to think of somebody she'd heard criticising some other person's appearance, and that was what happened. But I had always tended to assume that if you're criticising somebody's chin, they're going to have a receding chin. So I'd sort of always thought of Mr Elliot looking like that.
Yeah. They spend a lot of time talking about Mr Elliot and how he's explained away everything from the past.
Yeah.
And Sir Walter and Elizabeth believe him. So then Mr Elliot calls on them at 10 o'clock at night for reasons.
Well, I think it is basically to celebrate his closeness, to make a statement that I don't regard myself as just a general acquaintance. I regard myself as family, and therefore I've come in late at night. And they're thrilled to bits. We haven't had yet any real hints of Mr Elliot putting himself out. I mean, it's Anne who hopes it's Elizabeth he's after. Elizabeth hopes it.
Elizabeth hopes, and Mrs Clay is encouraging her to hope that that's why he's coming.
We just wonder, has he started his own courting of Mrs Clay?
Who knows? He turns up and he hasn't forgotten Anne, and Anne thinks he has good manners. And Anne thinks he's a sensible man.
And they have a lovely time talking about Lyme.
Yeah, and she also finds that, like Lady Russell, Mr Elliot is actually interested in listening to what she has to say.
About the accident.
Yeah, about the accident and entering into her concerns about it. And so it's just... Whereas she'd arrived thinking she's going to spend the entire evening trapped with her father and her sister and having to listen to them, she suddenly had an evening where there's someone interesting and nice and polite and sensible to talk to.
And what are we seeing as Mr Elliot's motivation here with Anne? Perhaps seeing this really pretty woman, he suddenly thinks, that could be a way out.
Well, again, we don't know. My feeling is at this point, Mr Elliot has called on Sir Walter and Elizabeth without necessarily expecting to have any real pleasure in the evening, but as you said, to show that he's on this family footing with them, because that's all part of his plan. And he sees Anne, and he and Anne find someone who is intelligent and interesting and polite.
Nice to look at.
Nice to look at and nice to talk to. So he and Anne, I think they just connect because... they can talk to each other and they can enjoy talking to each other.
Yes.
In a way that neither of them can enjoy talking to Sir Walter or to Elizabeth.
Yes.
The last thing, I guess, to say about this chapter is that he stayed an hour with them. The elegant little clock on the mantelpiece had struck, quote marks, 11 with its silver sounds, and the watchman was beginning to be heard at a distance. Now, first of all, I like this little picture of the watchman, which of course is just one of the things you don't get in the country, but in the town you have the watchman calling the hours. But also, apparently this quote, 11 with its silver sounds, no one has been able to identify the exact quote. The closest...
Oh, it is in quotations.
It's in quotation marks. And the closest anyone has been able to come is maybe in The Rape of the Lock, where it says, and the pressed watch returned a silver sound. But that means that the quote marks aren't quite right. And I wonder if this is maybe just something that Jane Austen wrote and then would have gone back to check on later, but later didn't happen.
Or she might have put the quotation marks around a smaller amount of it.
Yes, she might have just put them around silver sounds.
Yes.
But for whatever reason, it's appeared there as a full quotation. People have not been able to identify it, so maybe the quotation marks are in the wrong place.
One would expect her to be fairly familiar with The Rape of the Lock.
Yeah. That's everything I had to say on the chapters, so shall we move on to favourite sentences now?
All right, well, I'll have a go with mine. I'm always interested in what Jane Austen has to say about children and so on. And this is the one I've chosen, which is part of the Christmas celebrations at Uppercross. Immediately surrounding Mrs Musgrove were the little Harvilles, whom she was sedulously guarding from the tyranny of the two children from the cottage, expressly arrived to amuse them. So you've got these polite little Harvilles, who are fortunately used to Mrs Musgrove, who's been minding them on and off.
Yeah, but have been brought into this much bigger house than they're used to.
Yes.
And then Charles and Mary's two little terrors are invited over to amuse them.
And who are probably younger than they are. So possibly they've got their, really precious little toys made by their father. And there are these little boys coming in and throwing them up and down and snatching them and playing with them. What about yours?
Well, I was torn between two, but since you've already talked about the Christmas at the Musgroves, I won't have the one about Lady Russell saying she'd have to remember not to call it Uppercross in the holidays. So instead, I'm going to go with Anne having learned that Mr Elliot has now been welcomed back into the family. Anne was not animated to an equal pitch by the circumstance, but she felt that she would rather see Mr Elliot again than not, which was more than she could say for many other persons in Bath. It's a pretty negative picture of what she's anticipating she'll have in Bath, and I suppose those many other persons in Bath include Sir Walter and Elizabeth.
Yes.
But again, it's just one of those beautifully balanced sentences Jane
Yes.
Austen gives us. Today, the characters we're going to be talking about are Mr and Mrs Musgrove.
Mr and Mrs Musgrove Senior, not
Yes.
not Charles,
Yes.
not Charles and Mary.
Yeah, not Charles and Mary, Mr and Mrs Musgrove Senior.
The only thoughts I had about them was trying to, in a sense, position them, partly in terms of what Jane Austen says about them belonging to an earlier generation of the gentry, but just to sort of see again how would they fit in. I mean, they obviously, as far as I can see, they are very much of the gentry. They may not be as elegant as perhaps the people were at Mansfield Park.
Yes, it actually describes them when they're first introduced as Mr and Mrs Musgrove were a very good sort of people, friendly and hospitable, not much educated and not at all elegant. But they're bringing up their children in the newer style.
Yes, I wonder about the not much educated. Perhaps, say, Mrs Musgrove hadn't been taught any particular accomplishments and probably had spent a bit more time learning to be, in effect, the housekeeper. Because anyway, I think we can guess that Mrs Musgrove has come up in the world a little bit by marrying Mr Musgrove.
Whereas her sister went down in the world a little bit by marrying
Mr Hayter.
Though even then, Charles Musgrove says that the Winthrop is a very good sort of property. But yes, it does say that the Musgroves are in the first social circle in the country. And the Hayters wouldn't be anyone at all if it wasn't for their connection with the Musgroves.
Yes, so Lady Russell does visit the Musgroves.
Yep.
There's no way Lady Russell would probably be visiting the Hayters.
Yeah. Mr and Mrs Musgrove do seem to be a supremely contented couple. They're obviously very comfortable with each other. Their main concern with their children is that they should be happy. So, when Henrietta wants to marry Charles Hayter, they sort of say, to be sure it wasn't a great match for her, but if Henrietta liked him, and she did seem to like him.
Yes.
That's at the start of the book. And then at the end, when they just let them get engaged because he's got something.
I just wonder, what are they going to do with that great big family?
Yeah, because their eldest son, Charles, obviously he's going to inherit, no problem there. Their next son would have been Dick, Richard. He went into one of the second son professions of the Navy. Presumably he was a troublesome boy, and so sending him off to the Navy at 13 solved both the he's a problem child, maybe the Navy will sort him out, and also he's the second son, so he needs a profession. So the Navy is a profession. But yes, they definitely have other younger boys.
Oh, yes.
So what will happen to
them?
them?
There were all these boys have all been sent off to boarding school, but are they now starting to send them to what later became the public school? The Eton, the Harrow, the Westminster, the Rugby, the major public schools. But there are other schools, they could have gone to private schools.
Yeah.
But obviously all the boys have been sent away to school, and so have the girls when they got into their teens. But one gets the impression, though perhaps this is just being too nice to the Musgroves, is believing that unlike Mr Bennet, they would have been saving away carefully with all these children, so they've got money to start them off. Anyway, they've certainly saved enough money to sort of get Louisa and Henrietta ready, educated up with their accomplishments and so on. And almost certainly they've got enough money set aside to be able to offer them comfortable money. So when Louisa marries Captain Benwick, they're going to have a fair bit of money.
Yeah.
I suppose what one feels is they're probably not unlike Mr Bennet, Mr Musgrove. I mean, he's not a cultivated man like Mr Bennet.
But also, we do know that Mr Musgrove goes to the assizes every year. So he's diligent about his duties as a country squire.
Yes.
We also know that the two of them, they're not that bright. No, maybe it's not fair to say they're not that bright, but they're not that sharp.
Oh, I think they probably are, that they simply don't talk about it so much, that they know perfectly well what is the sensible thing to do, but they don't have an elaborate vocabulary for describing it.
No, I suppose I'm thinking of the scene in Uppercross where Mrs Croft is talking about her travels. And first of all, Mrs Musgrove could never accuse herself of having called Bermuda and the Bahamas anything in her life. But also when Mrs Croft talks about how she didn't like that winter she spent at Deal when the Admiral, captain as he was then, was on the North Sea. And Mrs Musgrove says, oh yes, I always get so nervous when Mr Musgrove is at the assizes. It's like conflating two kind of different things. Yeah, the Admiral could have been killed on the seas. Mr Musgrove, I suppose that he could have been attacked on the road, but it's not all that likely.
Or perhaps she almost feels she doesn't feel safe without him at home.
Yeah.
Though she must have some sort of pretty hefty, a hefty butler and anyway, some very hefty footmen and so on. So, yes.
So the Musgroves, the point at which we're up to in today's chapters, that's the last we see of them for a while. In the original draft of the book, that was the last we would have seen of them. But then when Jane Austen rewrote that chapter and replaced it with 2 chapters, that's when she brought Mrs Musgrove and Henrietta and Charles and Mary into Bath. So that's when we get Anne being able to say that such excellent parents as Mr and Mrs Musgrove should be happy in their children's marriages. They do everything to confer happiness, I am sure. Your father and mother seem so totally free from all those ambitious feelings which have led to so much misconduct and misery both in young and old.
Is she having a swipe at Lady Russell there?
I don't think so. So yeah, it's just they're nice parents and they try to do the right thing by their children. They're pretty laid back. You know, they're of the old style, but they're letting their children basically bring all this modern stuff into the house, and they're just rolling with it. Maybe they've let Louisa get just a little bit out of control.
That's just a bit of silliness that's coming in with her initial flirting with Captain Wentworth. She's not out of control. It's just that he encourages her and she does it.
Yeah.
But obviously nobody thinks there's anything the matter with him jumping her off Styles. It's just that, you know, she's making a bit too much of it or taking too many chances.
Yeah. When we talked about Lady Russell, we were saying that she didn't really come off the page all that much. Whereas Mr and Mrs Musgrove, they really do. They're somewhat slight characters, but do you like Mr and Mrs Musgrove?
Oh, yes. Yes, of course you do. This is what I've written for the historical bit for this episode. The city of Bath that Jane Austen knew was built out of beautiful honey-coloured stone on hill slopes above a curve on the River Avon. The river ran around 3 sides of the town and the sloping hills filled in the 4th side. Underneath the bottom of this curve were hot springs of the kind that I talked about when we were discussing watering places in Emma.
Yep.
You know, the people would find them and they'd build up a town around them. Well, this had happened to Bath a long, long time ago. The springs at Bath had been known to contain health-giving lime sulfated waters, which could give relief from palsy, rheumatism, gout, leprosy, neuralgia, sciatica, chorea, diseases of the liver, and cutaneous and scrofulous affections.
Okay.
That comes from an 1875 encyclopedia, but I imagine that was what they were saying in Roman times and when Jane Austen was there. Some of these were cured by wallowing in water from one of the 6 hot springs. Others drinking filtered water sold in Jane Austen's time at the pump room.
2 times we've been to Bath, once last year in 2024 and once in the early 2000s. I tried the waters and they weren't actually as horrible as I thought they would be. It's more a sulphurous taste.
Yes.
But so Lady Russell drinks the waters and we know that Mrs Smith is taken to the hot baths.
Yes.
Well, the Crofts come because Admiral Croft is thought to be gouty.
Oh, I think he'd hop into one of the spouts. Yeah. He would be going daily, not just to drink the waters.
Yeah, though I guess he probably would have done that too.
Oh, yes, but if he's got gout, it would probably ease gout anyway to be stuck into warm water.
Yeah, warm mineral water.
Yes, there would have been some immediate benefit, even if not long term.
Yeah.
The springs at Bath had been known for a long, long time, and from the 1st to the 4th century AD, during the time that Britain was part of the Roman Empire, they were developed into a luxurious adjunct of Roman living. The Roman buildings then fell into decay with the advent of the Angles, Jutes and Saxons. However, people still knew about the springs. During the Anglo-Saxon period, they had a reputation for healing the sick, and Bath was known as the aching men's city, which is obviously a reference to rheumatism. The Venerable Bede, an English monk in the 8th century, mentioned them, as did a 9th century historian called Nennius, who talked about a hot lake surrounded by a wall which men could go to bathe in. In the 12th century, new baths were built around the springs, and a new hospital was founded beside one of them. Bath was known as a spa town during the Elizabethan period, and in 1613, Queen Anne visited to take the waters. The original Roman baths were rediscovered in 1775 when one of the floors of the buildings that had been built on top of them collapsed and they found the Roman baths underneath. During the Georgian period, the city was being redeveloped to a very high standard of luxury, with libraries, theatres and assembly rooms available to occupy the spare time of the invalids and of their relatives who flocked there every year, and then, a bit later, for the elderly people who chose to retire there. This is the Bath that Jane Austen's father retired to in 1801 until he died in 1805. But even after that, his wife and daughters remained there for another year, till 1806.
And actually, when Michael and I were in Bath last year, in 2024, we found that the house that the Austen family lived in while George Austen was still alive, the basement level of that house is available as an Airbnb. It's the kitchen area, but we were able to stay there. In the Google map that I made of Persuasion locations, which I'll share again in the show notes for this episode, but it's also on our website, in that I put in Bath all of the streets that are mentioned in the book that people live in and walk through. Yeah. They're all there still by name or almost by name. And one of the things that does become sort of apparent is that Westgate Buildings, which is where Mrs Smith is right down near the centre, close to some of the hot baths. So that suggests that's a cheaper area, but also convenient for her to be taken to the hot baths.
Yes.
Camden Place, where the Elliots are, is up in the higher bit, which when I did a guided tour of Bath, they said the higher bits were the posher areas.
Yes.
I actually even put a period print of it on the Google map, so you can see it has a nice view over Bath and the surrounding countryside.
Yeah.
By contrast, Rivers Street, which is where Lady Russell is, it's a little bit lower down. On the other hand, it's closer to places like Royal Crescent and the Circus.
Yes.
Which are, I think, the really posh parts of Bath.
Yes.
The White Hart Inn, which is where the Musgroves are staying, that's absolutely right in the centre of everywhere. You know, it says from the window, Mary can see the entrance to the baths. When Anne was leaving the White Hart to go back home, before she meets up with Captain Wentworth, it is actually going to be quite a hike. So it's really nice of Charles to offer to take her, because it'd be quite a walk and it'd be mostly uphill.
Yes.
I just found it really, really interesting to mark all these places on the map. Where I can, I've put in either period pictures of the time or photos I took myself when I was in Bath.
Oh, just to make one point about the difference between where the Elliots are and where Lady Russell is. The Elliots have hired a house. They've moved in. They've probably had to hire their own servants, whereas Lady Russell is in lodgings, which means that sounds from what you say, though, that they must be, really lovely lodgings.
I think so.
But these are obviously owned by somebody who provides their own servants and housekeeper and their own butler probably to open the door and so on. I'd just like at this point to explain two bits of knowledge that have jumped into my mind when I read the little bit when they finally arrive in Bath. Amidst the dash of other carriages, the heavy rumble of carts and drays, the bawling of newsmen, muffin men and milkmen, and the ceaseless clink of pattens. Now, what I'd like to sort of think about is just who these people were who were making this noise and why. And I think the cries of the milkman and the muffin man, well, we can guess what muffins were. This was just a man going around with a large shallow tray covered with a cloth, and under that were hot, freshly baked muffins, which is just, a flour and water snack that people could eat in the street. But it's just interesting that, in fact, these cries of street sellers became very fashionable over the next century. Well, usually called them London cries. Yeah. But there were pictures of them on plates and all sorts of things. But the other one I want to think about there is the description of patterns, which turn up in a lot of people's reminiscences of life in the 19th century. Do you know?
Yeah, they're the wooden things you put under your shoes so they don't get muddy when you're walking in the street.
Yes, and having finally seen a proper picture of a pattern on Google, I realise I've been visualising them wrong for quite a long time. What they were was a thinnish piece of wood with a strap over it and to which people could put their shoes, and under it was a sort of slightly decorative circle of ironwork with 3 or 4 spikes going up into this wooden sole. And the point was that they then had an ability to walk through muddy places, not just around their own cow yards and things, but anywhere in the street, because their shoes were raised about an inch above any mess there might be. But of course, if you've got everybody clattering along on these little iron pedestals, you've got a fairly considerable noise.
Yes.
Nevertheless, I think that in Persuasion, Jane Austen is primarily using Bath as a place where she can further explore the obsession with rank that she introduced at the beginning of the book with Sir Walter. I have a sense that throughout the whole book, Jane Austen has been made uneasy by the social relations, by the way in particular members of the gentry level society relate to one another, and their constant asserting of their own status and their fawning on the aristocracy. With people like Sir Walter, Anne has got the right standards according to her. Yeah. But even Lady Russell goes a bit far in the other direction. If we compare the way she drew the Bath of Northanger Abbey with that of Persuasion, we find a very different sort of picture. Just compare these early introductions. In Northanger Abbey, we have "How uncomfortable it is," whispered Catherine, "not to have a single acquaintance here." "Aye, so we do. That is very disagreeable. I wish we had a large acquaintance here. I wish we had any. It would be somebody to go to." So we get that very unfriendly, unwelcoming Bath in Northanger Abbey. But in Persuasion, on the other hand, she suggests it is a place where residents are trying to thrust their acquaintanceship on new arrivals. When Sir Walter and Elizabeth arrive, they start boasting that their acquaintance was exceedingly sought after. Everybody was wanting to visit them.
Would the difference there be that Sir Walter is a baronet, whereas Mr and Mrs Allen are just people.
Are just visitors.
Yeah.
Yes, well, very likely. So we had the picture of, it was known that they'd arrived, and the servants up and down the road were telling one another, it's a baronet who's moved in there, and so that all these people who wanted to be upwardly mobile are leaving cards there in the hope that they'll be taken up.
Mm.
Moreover, Sir Walter, Elizabeth and Lady Russell join in this toadying when their Irish cousins arrive. Sir Walter writes a grovelling letter apologising for past neglect, and then the toils of the business were over. The sweets began. They visited in Laura Place. They had the cards of the Dowager Duchess Dalrymple and the Honourable Miss Carteret to be arranged wherever they might be most visible, and our cousins in Laura Place, our cousins Lady Dalrymple and Miss Carteret, were talked of to everybody. I think, to bring it back to all the themes of Persuasion, it is a place that she's chosen to show off. Snobbery isn't quite the right word. The sort of toadying that
the Elliots expect people to do to them.
Yes, and sort of how she really disapproves of Sir Walter being so proud of being a baronet, that he behaves in this way.
Mm.
And one of the things, of course, she's doing is showing the superiority of the way the naval officers relate to one another and to the rest of society.
Mm. At first, Sir Walter is quite dismissive and says, oh, yes, I know there are some sailors here. I'm sure they'll find their own circle.
Yes.
But then later you hear that, yes, in fact, the Crofts do have quite a large circle of acquaintance in Bath and have a very, very active social life.
Yes.
And, meet people on the street all the time who know them.
Yes.
I've now gone through all of the pop culture adaptations of Persuasion, the ones that are at least nominally set in the correct period. So now I'm going to look at film modernizations of it. And interestingly, the earliest one I can find is 2019. There don't seem to have been any modernizations of Persuasion before then. The one I'm going to talk about today is a web series, because of course there's a web series since there have been of all the others. This was made by independent filmmakers Alan Barrios, Ruiz Pagano, Hazel Jeffs, Jessamine Lee and Anya Steiner. They crowdfunded it and they did the first 5 episodes and released them in 2019. And then they did some more crowdfunding and they got enough money to shoot the rest of the series, which they were planning to do in the spring of 2020. But of course, the global pandemic happened and so they couldn't do anything. But in 2022, they were finally able to resume, and they even managed to get most of the cast back. And as part of their publicity for that, they actually contacted us at the time, and I did a little mini episode where I spoke to some of them about what they were doing. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
How much money do they have to spend on setting these things up?
Not a lot of money.
So they get their props and their settings from around and about the place, do they?
They actually said that for this one, a lot of the actors supplied their own clothes because they had clothes that were suitable to the kind of character they were presenting.
They don't ever get into naval uniform.
There's no navy in this version.
Oh, right.
In terms of the setup of this adaptation, a lot of the other web series have been done as sort of vlog style. People, for reasons that sometimes worked and sometimes were stretching credibility a bit, people are talking about their own lives to camera to go on YouTube. This one mostly isn't done like that. It's just done as if it was a TV series.
Yes.
Except much, much shorter episodes. And it is inspired by rather than a full point-for-point modernisation of the book, although they do touch a lot of the key plot points. So the setup is that the Elliot family has become the Elias family. Their family background is from Argentina and they run a travel agency in North America.
And why did these people choose Argentina?
One of the showrunners does have an Argentinian background and she felt that the kind of family pressures that were placed on her with that background fitted with what they were trying to do with Persuasion. So Anna Elias, who is obviously Anne, and Fred Wentworth were boyfriend-girlfriend when they were at school. But after they finished school, he went travelling and he had a popular travel blog and then he wrote a book and it did very well. And while he was doing that, Anna went to college and did a business degree and then just started working for her father's travel agency. The first episode is cutting between him and her. He's blocked on writing his second book, and he's been speaking to his sister Sophie, and she says he should come and stay with her. In the meantime, Anna, who's been working for her father, you can see even in these early scenes, has been a bit crushed by it all. And he tells her that the business isn't doing all that well at the moment, and he's going to have to let her go for a while. And her sister Marisol invites her to come and stay with her. And it just so happens that Sophie Wentworth and Anna's sister Marisol live in the same building. Yeah. So that first episode is basically bringing these two people into the same place without you actually knowing anything about their backstory. Because it's a web series on zero budget, they cut a lot of the characters. They cut Elizabeth Elliot completely.
Yes.
They cut Lady Russell. And part of the reason for that was when you put out a casting call for this sort of web series, older, more established actors, they just are less interested in doing this sort of thing, whereas younger actors who are trying to find a career
and show what they can do in effect. Yes.
So they don't have Lady Russell, but what they do have is in those first 5 episodes, Marisol and her partner Charlie have a dog which is called Russell. Russell, the dog, was in fact owned by the actor who played Anna. And when they came back for their second season in 2022, she had moved and it was just going to be too complicated to bring the dog back across multiple state lines. So in the first episode in season 2, they're getting a second dog, which is called Lady. So they have the 2 dogs, Lady and Russell. There's no Admiral Croft, there's no Mr and Mrs Musgrove, there's no Charles Hayter, there's no Harvilles, and there's no Mrs Smith. So all of those characters and their plot lines are removed. There are some significant changes to some of the minor characters, partly because of things that the showrunners particularly wanted to include. One of the most changed is Mary, who has become Marisol. Now, she is gay and she is married to her female partner Charlie, and they have a really good, strong, healthy, loving relationship. It's really nice to see.
Yes.
And the other thing with Marisol is she is actually ill. She has a chronic illness, a form of juvenile arthritis. And they said one of the things they wanted to explore is, what if Mary really was actually ill? What if she had one of these invisible illnesses that people don't really pay attention to?
Yes.
So that was one aspect of her. But she's very, very supportive of Anna. So she's a completely and utterly different character.
Yeah.
It wasn't in any way, shape or form the Mary of the book. But I actually found she was a delightful character. She was so vibrant on the screen.
Yes.
And I really liked her relationship with Charlie. Now, the next character that was significantly changed is Louisa Musgrove, who has become Lewis. He's male. And of course, the corollary of that, therefore, is that Fred has to be bi, so that he can have a relationship with Lewis and also with Anna. Again, that was something they wanted to explore because they feel that bi characters are not given enough screen time. So one of the things they were interested in doing was exploring how Louisa's personality would work if she was a male character. But they also made significant changes again, in particular by giving Lewis an anxiety disorder. So at one point he actually has a full-blown panic attack, and that is the equivalent plot point of falling off the stairs.
Yes.
But he's quite immature, so he's overwhelmed by Fred being this famous blogger and travel writer, and so he's trying to impress him, and he's also trying to be the sort of person he thinks Fred would want him to be. Yeah. So Fred talks about going on hikes, and he says, I love hiking, where in fact he completely doesn't. And one of the things they said in an interview was a thing they wanted to explore is the fact that Fred and Lewis, as a relationship, they are not healthy together. They are not bringing out the best in each other. Lewis isn't being true to himself because he's trying to pretend to be the person he thinks Fred wants. And then when he has this panic attack, Fred just completely can't cope with it. And after that, Fred ghosts him. Lewis is actually trying to make contact again, and Fred is ignoring his messages. I did find him quite irritating, but then I have also found many of the Louisa Musgroves quite irritating.
Yes.
So whereas I loved Marisol and the way they'd changed her,
yes,
I didn't love Lewis in the same way.
Could it have been partly, though, that the actors weren't as good or the characterisation wasn't as...
I'm not sure if you were meant to be irritated by him or if you were meant to feel sympathetic towards him, but I felt more irritated than sympathetic, which is not nice.
And you said they've left out the Captain Bennet character.
No, he's the next one I'm talking about.
Oh, right.
So he is Ben. In fact, he is Ben Wick. He's brought in right from the very start. He is in fact Lewis's roommate. And it's clear to the audience, but not to Lewis, that he is in love with Lewis right from the start.
Yes.
I can only assume it's partly he feels protective of Lewis. He's a lot more mature than Lewis. Lewis is easily the most immature person in this. But they said the reason they brought him in from the start was they actually wanted to get people invested in his relationship with Lewis.
Yeah.
And I liked his performance, and I was actually quite invested in him getting what he wanted. I was just kind of disappointed that what he wanted was Lewis.
All right,
But-
but you felt he could have done better.
Yes.
As Captain Wentworth did about Captain Benwick.
Yes. So Mr Elliot is a character called Elliot, who is a very corporate type and is brought in to help the travel agency and get it back on track. He's not a villain. He's just not what Anna wants. Anna herself, she's always quite tense and uptight, except in some flashback scenes. And so I didn't really see her getting her bloom back. I still think the only actress who's really nailed that was Amanda Root in the 1995 version. So even at the end, she's still nervous and very self-conscious and tense. But what we do see happening, she maybe doesn't get her bloom or her relaxation back, but what she does do is she starts to make her own decisions. Even early on, there have been hints that she's been looking at going back to grad school. And there comes a point where she just walks out of her father's office, contacts Sophie Wentworth,
Yes.
Fred's sister, who is doing a PhD, about how to get into grad school.
Yes.
And so you see her actually, even if she's not getting her bloom back in the looks way, and even if she's still awkward around Fred, she is definitely taking ownership of her own life. Fred himself, he's not good at relationships. He also kind of grows throughout, because the impression you get is in between Anna when he was at high school and Lewis when this is happening, he hasn't actually had a proper relationship. And so he's sort of having to learn how to do relationships in this.
Yes.
But I guess I wasn't entirely convinced of his growth.
And you didn't see him as very attractive to a whole lot of people.
He was okay. Now, like I said, this is done more as just a TV series, not speaking to camera vlog episodes. But one interesting thing they did, which the only other version that really did this a bit was the Spanish version, is they have told the Fred and Anna story in flashbacks. And those flashbacks are to a blog that Anna kept when she was at high school.
Oh,
So
right.
they have young Anna and young Fred and also young Marisol in one case. It's the same actors, they just made them look younger.
Oh, right.
But interestingly, they didn't do just one vlog flashback episode, they sprinkled it throughout the entire series. So the series ran for 18 episodes.
Yes.
And the final flashback, which is the one that actually shows the two of them breaking up,
Yes.
that was episode 16.
Oh,
So you saw Anna being happy, and some of the earlier vlogs were actually a little bit cringy, but that's kind of, I guess, symptomatic of vlogs done by people while they're still in high school. But they kind of showed you that relationship changing, and they showed you some of the influences on Anna that made her change her mind. Just one other thing is that this didn't have as much comedy in the book, and I think a lot of that is the changes to Mary, because Mary is the supremely comic character in the book, and all of the other more nominally faithful adaptations played up Mary as a comic character and played up Charles as kind of her straight man. Marisol and Charlie, they're great, I really like them, but they don't have that comedy. So that's missing, which is kind of sad.
Yes.
As I said, it's inspired by Persuasion. It's not Persuasion. I did feel they gave Ben more of a character story than they did in the book. In terms of all the other YouTube series I've seen of different Jane Austen novels, I wouldn't put it above Lizzie Bennet Diaries, and I also wouldn't put it above From Mansfield with Love. I would probably say, while Emma Approved is a slicker, more professional production, in some ways I liked aspects of this better because
It's
it was
more moving, isn't
yeah,
it?
this was more moving. Having said that, there were bits where the performances weren't great. So look, overall, I certainly didn't hate this.
Do you want to ever watch it again?
I'm not sure if I'd ever watch it again. I might. I'd be more inclined to watch this again than I would some of the others, but not as much as Lizzie Bennet Diaries or From Mansfield with Love. But that again, it's just personal preference after all.
Yes.
And some of the things they did worked for me, some of the things they did didn't work so well for me, and some of the performances I thought were good, some were less good. You could kind of tell it was filmed on a bit of a shoestring,
Yes.
but that's okay. It was.
Yes.
So that's that one. Next time I'm going to be talking about another modernisation. I think it was a telly movie. It was called Modern Persuasion. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be reading chapters 16 to 18 of Persuasion.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the sacred text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com. We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.